Autism is one of the most common developmental conditions of early childhood. It affects about 1 in 54 kids. The key symptoms of autism are really two things. One is restrictive and repetitive interests or behaviors. Children with autism really like a lot of structure in how they play and their interests. So you might see in young kids like they really like to play just in a certain way. Maybe they want to line up all their toys in a certain order, or maybe they're only interested in like Thomas the Tank Engine and they can't be interested in anything else. Or if mom changes her hairstyle, they completely freak out. And then the second is social communication challenges. Children with autism often are delayed in speaking, or they might not speak at all. And if they do speak, often they speak more in a functional way and not so much for sharing or for experiencing something with another person. So an early sign of autism, for instance, is not pointing to show. A typical child around age 1 or 1.5 will like point at an airplane in the sky and say, "Look, mama." But a kid with autism might not point to show somebody else something, or if someone else pointed at something, they might not look at it, because sharing interest is something that is really challenging for kids on the autism spectrum. With kids with autism, you have to teach them to point at things. It's not because they don't want to or they don't care, they don't think that what you think is interesting. It's just that they don't have that skill. Their brain connections are not connected that way. But I always like to say that autism isn't just bad things, it's a lot of good things too. And kids with autism have a lot of creativity. They have a lot of enthusiasm for the things that they love. There's a lot of people with autism who are grown up to be successful adults and are working in all sorts of different careers. The way you diagnose it is through behavioral testing. And this is a pretty involved process that often takes like at least half a day, having them do activities that would be particularly challenging and seeing if they don't do it. And it has to be done by somebody who's an expert in child development. Their pediatrician or their teacher or somebody will refer them to a psychologist or a developmental pediatrician who has expertise in diagnosing autism. And they have a standard series of kind of behavioral measures, and parents usually complete a checklist also. And that's how a kid is ultimately diagnosed. Early identification is super important. We know that if kids get into treatment before school age, when they're 2 or 3, that's when kids' brains are most plastic. You can get kids into therapy when they're 1 or 2 versus 7 or 8. You can make so much more progress, and those kids will have benefits from that early therapy for the rest of their life. But it really does help kids long term if we get them into treatment early. Why are Latinx kids diagnosed so much later than other kids? So we know that the average age of autism diagnosis in the US is before school age, like around 4.5. But Latinx kids are diagnosed up to a year or 2 later, usually after they enter kindergarten. We know that kids could be diagnosed with autism much earlier, even as before age 3 for most kids. Latino kids are diagnosed several years later than, say, white male counterparts. That's pretty much true across the United States. So why is that? It's complicated is what I'd say, and I'd say my research has shown. We just talked about the process for getting autism diagnosed. It's pretty complicated. You have to go to a doctor. The doctor has to refer you to another doctor who has expertise. A lot of times those places where you need to go are at children's hospitals, big cities, a lot of families who have fewer resources, who maybe don't understand our healthcare system as well, who don't have as much experience with the healthcare system, may have really trouble just navigating that process to getting a diagnosis. And hospitals also make it difficult for families by requiring them, for instance, to complete a lot of paperwork prior to making an appointment, requiring a lot of documentation from children's community and schools before they'll even agree to make an appointment. Part of it is just that the system that we have set up is very complicated, and frankly, it's pretty racist. It makes it much easier for people who are acculturated to the US and have a lot of experience navigating our system and who speak English really well and can read and write in English really well to access care. One of the things I say to other pediatricians is think about a kid with autism. And then I say, how many of you thought of a white boy? A lot of them, they did think of a white boy. And because that is traditionally who we think of as has autism, and there should be no differences by race, ethnicity in terms of who has autism. We're not looking for autism in Latino children and other children of color. And if we're not looking for it, then we're not going to find it. Then another important factor is sort of families and communities. You know, if you go to a wealthy white neighborhood, parents will say to me, how are you saying that autism is underdiagnosed? Because I see autism everywhere. It almost seems like it's overdiagnosed to me. And I say, well, that's your neighborhood. In more wealthy communities, autism is just more prevalent. And then more people know somebody who has it, then you're more likely to realize that's what's going on with your own child. But on the other hand, I've spoken with like Spanish-speaking Latino moms who said, you know, the first time that I heard the word autism was when my doctor mentioned it to me. I didn't even know what that word was. It's not really present in Spanish language media as much as it is in mainstream media, especially Spanish-speaking Latino parents. One of the things that'll happen is that they'll have concerns about autism in their child, and then they'll go talk to their friends and their parents and their community members, and those people, you know, with good intention will say, oh, you're just not spending enough time with the child. It's just because you're not strict enough with him. Even if they think their child might have autism, they might be reassured by their community members and say, oh, well, you know, your uncle didn't talk until he was 5 and now he's doing great. When we know it's super important to pick up on those early signs, it's important that people in the family and the community know about it. We just have to spread knowledge. If you're a parent of a toddler, if your child is delayed in his or her language, if that child doesn't make eye contact, if that child seems like they're in their own world or not so interested in other kids, if they're not pointing to show you things or looking where you point, they're not coming to you to show things that they're interested in or sharing interest, you should be concerned that your child might be on the autism spectrum. We know that acting early is important. Even if other people reassure you, even if your doctor reassures you, if you think in your heart that something is different about your kid, it's important to get an evaluation. And the first step to getting an evaluation is your county early intervention or early childhood special education program. If your child's under 5, the evaluation is free. It doesn't cost anything for families. It's part of our educational system for children under age 5. If you think that something's going on with your child, you're probably right. We know that parent concerns about child development are like 90% of the time correct. One of the things we see in autism is that kids can have a lot of really disruptive behavior. And it's not the kid's fault. It's not the parent's fault either. It's just that these kids' brains are wired a little bit differently. Things like transitions, things that happen surprisingly, are harder for them to manage than kids with a typically developing brain. And I think sometimes when you match that with cultural expectations sort of around being polite, respecting elders, being sociable, it can become a real challenge. And I think especially for parents of kids on the autism spectrum, they often feel that there's a lot of blame put on them for their parenting. The truth is that this is a disability, and it actually exists in Latin America too. It's just that it's not as commonly recognized there. Kids don't want to get in conflict with their parents any more than the parents do with the kids. And if the kids could do these things, they would, but they can't. They need help. We have a world that works best with people's brains who are typically wired, and unfortunately for kids on the autism spectrum, that means they need to do a lot of extra work to fit in. The sooner we can start that work, the easier the load is going to be on them. The other thing I would sort of bring up, and I think is pertinent to the Latino community in particular, is just the idea of disability stigma. I think Latino parents, because they're bridging kind of two cultures, often really feel this burden of stigma related to their child's disability. And autism is what we call an invisible disability, right? So it's not like they're pushing their child around in a wheelchair and everyone can see that they have extra challenges that other parents don't have. They don't see that, you know? I think parents carry this weight of constantly having to explain, I'm sorry he's doing this, he has autism or she has autism, or having to justify their parenting decisions in a way that parents of typically developing children don't have to do. One of the things we found in my research is we would do these focus groups with Latino parents, and often the focus group would be the first time they met another parent, Spanish-speaking parent who had a child with autism. We didn't intend them to be like support groups or anything, and we were trying to understand the problem and collect research data, but the parents liked meeting each other so much that several of them made little groups to continue meeting after our research study was over, just because having that community is so important. If we assume that race is a social construct and ethnicity is a social construct and that there's no biological differences really between Latinx kids and other kids, why are Latinx kids diagnosed so much later than other kids. We know that the average age of autism diagnosis in the US is before school age, like around 4.5. Latinx kids are diagnosed up to a year or two later, usually after they enter kindergarten. Why are some of the groups in the US getting much later diagnosis than others? And what can we do to help make that better? My name is Katherine Zuckerman. I am a general pediatrician and associate professor of pediatrics at Oregon Health and Science University, Dornbecker Children's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. My research focuses on equity and access to care for kids with autism. And the goal of all of my research and also the clinical care that I provide to kids is to make it so that early access to autism care isn't just something that wealthy white kids can get, but is something that every kid in the US can get. I want all of our kids to get high quality early autism care that they and their families need.